Alright everybody, welcome back. This third and final video introduces the entry-exit dynamic into the system and allows us to draw some of our conclusions about the nature of immunity, which is the third concept of stability in the paper. We'll look a little bit at how durability and balance work in this in the system, though I have found that by and large immunity or degree of immunity in a system does not strongly correlate with high or low durability or high or low balance. We can see those two dynamics or those two concepts of stability clearly in the first video, but here we're going to focus primarily on the idea of immunity. Okay, so the first thing I've done is I've turned on the entry-exit dynamic, and let me tell you what that involves. So first, carrying capacity is now going to be relevant. In fact, it's going to be very relevant because agents are going to be able to enter the system up until we get to the point of the carrying capacity. Now, once you hit the carrying capacity, an algorithm, sometimes called a Grim Reaper algorithm, will kick in and it will kill an agent at random. And that means if the two agent strategies are entering into the system at different rates, so for instance, suppose the reasonables are entering at twice the rate as the rational agents, it means that eventually the reasonable agents will replace all of the rational agents because they're entering at twice the rate, but turtles are being killed at random. So what this system allows us to do is to allow one agent strategy to entirely replace the other. So it's a way of approximating elements of an evolutionary game. But in this case, the agents are playing much more with a much more sort of traditional mindset involved. It's not, say, just imitation or something along those lines. So the carrying capacity is going to be very important. I set it relatively low at 100 because the larger and larger the model gets in terms of agents, just dramatically more complicated and long it takes to run the program. But perhaps the most important thing is going to be the conditions on which they're allowed to enter, because the entry conditions on my model are relative to the average score of the other strategy. So as we saw in the last video, the reasonables were able to keep their average score, the score of all the reasonable agents of the system, higher than the merely rational players. And that was because they were able to play each other cooperatively more often than the merely rational players were able to sort of find and defect on them. So we want to see if this dynamic persists and whether that allows the reasonable agents to defeat the rational agents. Now it turns out in many cases it does, but it takes a while because we see that what I've effectively done with the entry rate is created a kind of profit margin. So when the reasonables have a score significantly higher than the rational agents, that signals to other agents, or the reasonable agents, hey, enter the system because there's profit to be had, there's gain to be had. But the more reasonable agents get into the system, the more that margin, or the more than that signal diminishes, and so the more slowly they enter the system. And so what you can see is that they'll sometimes reach a kind of equilibrium, say between merely rational agents or merely reasonable agents, or both at the same time. So sometimes, there'll be 10 rational agents in the system, 90 reasonable agents, and there'll be a little bit of fluctuation. And that's just because of how the relevant profit margins worked out, because at that ratio, neither one of them has a sufficiently high margin of score ahead of the other that any agents of either strategy type are invited into the system or are eager to enter the system. But most of the time, actually, with this model, one strategy beats the other eventually. Okay, so one of the things that you'll want to pay attention to now is that you're going to look not just at the rational score and the reasonable score, because that's going to tell you when an agent of either type is going to start entering the system, but we're going to start tracking the number of rational agents and the number of reasonable agents of the system. We're also going to be looking at the survival rate. The survival rate's pretty simple. It's just the percentage of reasonable agents it's just the percentage of reasonable agents in the system, or the reasonable agents divided by the total number of agents in the system. So that's going to be relatively straightforward, but survival is going to be a critical monitor for us because survival just is the idea of immunity. If a system can maintain a 90% survival rate, then that means it has a high degree of immunity at that particular point in time. But as I say in the paper, immunity is really better thought of as a property of the system over time. So eventually what we want in a highly immune system is for survival to hit 1. That is, for there to be only reasonable agents left in the system. So a system can have a high degree of immunity if it resists, say, immediate takeover by merely rational agents. But what we'd ideally like is a system that could start with a not insignificant number of rational agents, and yet the reasonable agents to win out anyway. And that is, I think, sometimes what we see. So let me move things just a little bit. So we're going to set up, and you'll watch the numbers of agents. Okay, so you can start to see a kind of interesting dynamic forming. We've reached the carrying capacity of the system. Right, so we're at about 100. We're at 101 agents right now. This just means there's been a little bit of time before the Grim Reaper algorithm removes one of the agents from the system. We saw initially that a whole lot of agents, irrational agents, entered because at this point, the score of the rational players was higher than the reasonable players. But as more rational agents entered the system, they started encountering each other, and the reasonable agents were able to eventually find one another and start to interact. For instance, you can see that there's a cluster here. This the graph loops around, so this is just one cluster, and that as a result of that, they're able to cooperate with each other more and more over time, and to increase their average score. A very important feature of this model, which I didn't think mattered, but turns out to matter a lot, and I'm a little worried about it, is what score the entering agents have. So it turns out if all the entering agents, both rational and reasonable, are at 0, the reasonable agents win basically all of the time. And the standard deviation for how much variation there is extremely small. They just win basically all the time. So what I've allowed them to do is enter at the average score of the agents in the system, which I thought would sort of put the brakes on that a bit. And it turns out that it does, though it does have the interesting effect of causing the average payoffs of the reasonable agents to increase. Whereas if they had entered at an average score of 0, it tends to balance out. But I think there's a certain kind of logic to that. If you imagine a society that can attract people, or that can also allow them to leave, we can imagine it, I think, reasonably growing over time, agents making each other better and better off as time goes on. So in a sense, we have a kind of growth game where cooperative agents are able to increase each other's average payoffs. And that dynamic does result in being able to beat the merely rational agents, but it turns out it doesn't actually help the reasonable agents beat the rational agents in comparison to a situation where both kinds of turtles entered with an average score of 0. So, I mean, one thing you can see, and well, you actually can't see that, but if you go to the turtles in the model and you look at their average scores, you inspect them, it's called, you can find that the entering agents will have the average score, and that seems to be playing a role in increasing their margin of payoff over the rational agents. Okay, so let's just allow it to go a little bit further. And what you see is, the dynamic continues, and eventually what happens is that we reach a point, and it's taking a little while longer than it usually does. There, right there. See, the number of rational agents went to 0. And now we have a system where there's just reasonable agents with an entry-exit dynamic. Okay, so here, and this is very important, you may think, oh, we're back to the simple, well-ordered society model, right? I mean, what we have here is, there are a larger number of agents than in the system before, But this system should be like the simple well-ordered society model. But that isn't right because we have the EntryExit dynamic. So the Grim Reaper algorithm is still removing an agent from the system at random. And there are still agents entering the system whenever they're able to. So whenever a spot opens up, because right now, their average scores exceed that of the merely rational agent. Now, one thing you can do in this situation, if you want to make it, the sort of the simple well-ordered society model, is you just turn off the entry-exit dynamic, and then you just let them interact, and you effectively have the same system. And in fact, we can even get there to the same numbers if we reduce the carrying capacity. And then we turn the entry-exit dynamic off, and you can see it just looks exactly like the simple well-ordered society model. Okay, so why does this matter? Well, it matters because the cool thing about immunity is you can start off in a situation where you're not in a fully well-ordered society, right? You have rational agents in the system. You have people that are refusing to comply, not merely because they lack assurance, but because they like defecting. They think they can do better by doing that. And if you can show that a system has a high degree of immunity, meaning that even if you introduce rational agents to the system, that you will still end up with a reasonable players taking over, that's extremely attractive. And it's extremely attractive for two reasons. Number one, just within ideal theory, we can see that even just with a little bit of perturbations of the entering of non-reasonable agents, they don't take over the system. And so we do have, I think, even within ideal theory, a notion of stability that is genuinely distinct from that of durability and that of balance. So we have, our third concept of stability, which is immunity. But I think the cooler feature is that we have not just a model of stability that tells us what to do in ideal theory, but a model that tells us what to do to transition from non-ideal theory to ideal theory. So a non-ideal system, say, would have, a pretty large, subset of the, we can go up to 25. I mean, we can go down to 12 or whatever for, whatever portion of the population you're interested in. And we can see that, say, over time, even though the rational agents will seem to do well, right? So I didn't turn on the entry-exit switch, but now we have it, and we can see that even in this system, because the reasonable agents are able to congregate together, they are able to resist the rational agents. And so we have a notion of stability that allows us to proceed from non-ideal theory to ideal theory, to find a transitional path from a non-ideal situation to an ideal situation. So we have a notion of stability that helps us to bridge the gap between non-ideal and ideal theory, which I think is neat, because really what Rawls wanted, I think what Rawlsians want out of a well-ordered society model, is a model that can resist perturbations, that can keep itself together, right? And I mean, one of the coolest things about you could have with a social order is it could survive a lot of shock to the system, including a sizable portion of the population that was only defecting all the time. So I think that turns out to be just a really nice feature of the system. You can see also, and I just sort of make this general point, that if you have a high intrinsic propensity and a low social sensitivity, good. Well, this is the proper time to make that point then. So every once in a while, it doesn't happen all the time, but it does happen a sizable minority of the time, the rational agents in fact take over. And you've just witnessed a case that I can't produce just by running it at random, right? Because it's a non-deterministic system, so I can't just prepare an instance of this that I want for you to look at and make it all look nice, right? It's going to be a surprise whenever it happens, which is one of the cool things about agent-based modeling. But we had a situation where the reasonable agents weren't able to get it together. The rational agents were able to disrupt that core from forming and were able to, stay out in front. And the result of this is, and this is pretty interesting too, obviously social trust completely collapses. But also, look at this. The rational agents are gradually lowering their score. They're just defecting on each other all the time. And so they're eating everything that their society produced thanks to the reasonable agents. So if the rational agents win, they lose. And eventually their rational score, it does level out because the agents actually never lose their score. They're just adding a lower and lower bit of score. So it's approaching asymptotically the lowest score that the system logic would allow them to have. So I think, another nice feature of this is that we can see that the rational agents, when they win out, do badly. Okay, so I think we've sort of seen the bits of the model, and if you've read the paper, hopefully a lot of this is clear. But this paper, again, was called 3 Concepts of Political Stability, and I wanted to use an agent-based model in order to try to distinguish different aspects of stability that I think in some ways could be, to some degree, distinct fields of study. So we looked at the idea of durability and the idea of balance, both of them obviously very important. But the idea of immunity is also important. And when we talk about stability, I think we have those different ideas in mind. First, that the system has a high degree of social trust in the long run. Second, that there isn't a huge amount of variation. The level of confidence that people have in their society, right? That's having a high degree of balance. And we also want to allow that if there are some agents that don't comply, they don't find themselves reaping such great rewards that they're able to destroy the system. So I think the cool thing about an agent-based model is it allowed us to separate explicitly out these 3 different concepts that have not been distinguished in the literature. And so in a way, a lot of this paper is arguing that we just know so much more about how to model complex systems now than we have in the past, and that I think the public reason literature in general, given its concern with political stability, could benefit a great deal from these tools. I certainly have in learning how to use them. So just before I end, I really just want to say this. This is the first model that I built. I'm pretty excited about it, but I'm prepared to be disappointed because I know that building models is very difficult. And that I'm not a social scientist, I'm just a philosopher. So if you're watching this video, I would appreciate any criticisms from you at all. I mean, you don't have to be mean about it, but I'm willing to change my mind. If you have a better idea and you send it along to me and you think it's a good corrective, then I will change the details. And if the article has already come out in Social Philosophy and Policy and there's an error, well, then I will post it to this part of the website. And depending on how the book is doing at that time, I will make those changes in the book, and I will thank you explicitly and happily. So I welcome your comments and criticisms. Again, I'm new at this, and so there are probably some mistakes that I won't be able to see. So I'm hopeful and eager to hear from you. Thanks.